This is the third Sunday of Advent. So today we light the third candle of our Advent wreath, the pink one. Traditionally, this is the one known as the candle of hope. It's a beautiful name, isn't it? The candle of hope. But what is hope? You know, several years ago, I went to an all-day seminar at St. Andrew's Church in Saratoga. The subject of the seminar was a book called The Hidden Power of the Gospels. The seminar was led by the book's author, a man named Alexander Shia. Alexander comes from an ancient Lebanese family, a Christian Lebanese family. His ancestors had lived for centuries, many centuries, in the southern area of Lebanon, just a few miles north of Galilee, the region where Jesus grew up and lived most of his life. In fact, the chances are that those ancestors were among the very first Christians in the world. His family have been Christians for as long as there have been Christians. For millennia, they have lived in the same village in southern Lebanon. But then, in the 1950s, they were forced to flee. They left to escape the ongoing violence caused by border disputes between Lebanon and Israel. The whole village left, not only Alexander's entire extended family, but most of their neighbors too. They all moved together. They went, of all places, to Birmingham, Alabama. They chose Birmingham because it already had a small Lebanese American community and a Lebanese Christian church. At that point, though, in the period following World War II, Birmingham was notorious, even in the Jim Crow South, for the viciousness of its racism. The local Ku Klux Klan had developed a practice of using bombs and arson to bring terror and death to African Americans and other minorities. So many bombs, in fact, that the city came to be named Bombingham. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, there were no fewer than 40 bombings. And one small area where whites and blacks violated the rules by living together came to be known as Dynamite Hill. And yet it was this city that Alexander Shia's family chose to move. It was a city known around the world for its hatred of African Americans. And yet, there's a funny thing about hate. That is that hate never just stops with one group. The people who hate African Americans also hate Jews and Catholics and gays and Asians and immigrants and Muslims, and as it turns out, Christian Arabs too. Little Alexander quickly learned that there were places where it was not safe for him to go. There were many stores that he could not enter, swimming pools and parks where he was not permitted, schools that he could not attend, districts he had to avoid. They were all the same places that an African American child couldn't enter either. Birmingham's small community of Christian Arabs had always been close, of course. They had to be. They had to be in order to be safe. Alexander's large extended family kept very close too. And at the center of that family, holding it all together, was one woman. That woman was Alexander's grandmother, who everyone simply called Ceto. Ceto is Arabic for grandma, but everyone called her that. Her grandchildren, of course, but also her children, her nieces and nephews, her great-grandchildren, her cousins, her more distant relatives, as well as those outside the family. Even the priest called her Ceto. Alexander called her Ceto too. Let me tell you about my Ceto, Alexander said during the seminar at St. Andrews. Ceto was the pillar that held everything together. She was the gravity that pulled our large, unruly family together, as well as the bridge that linked us all to our heritage. In fact, he went on, my earliest memories was of sitting on my Ceto's lap as she chanted the Gospels to me in Arabic. The thing is, Ceto herself was illiterate. She couldn't read a word. But as with so many before her, she learned large sections of the Gospels by heart. And in our tradition, the main practice was not simply to say the Gospels or to read them, but to chant them. So those were my earliest memories, hearing the Gospels spoken to me by my grandmother in what was my first language, Arabic. As a result, I came to love those stories. I love them because they became inseparable from my Ceto's voice. Then one night, when Alexander was still a child, his mother woke him suddenly in his sleep. She was crying. Refusing to answer any question, she dressed him quickly. And the whole family rushed together to Ceto's house. And as they approached, Alexander saw in the distance flames rising in the darkness and was horrified to come up to Ceto's house, engulfed in flames. The fire cut through the darkness, angry flames flashing high into the moonless night. They all gathered around the house, wailing and crying out, convinced that their Ceto was dead. As it turned out, she was not. She had decided on a whim to go to church that night. It was not her usual night to attend church, but she decided on the very last minute to go. So they found her alive and wept with relief. But when they went into the house, they discovered that the house had obviously been set, clearly by the Ku Klux Klan. Everything in the house, particularly every religious artifact, had been placed in the center of the room and then doused with kerosene. It was from there that the fire spread. Eventually, evidently the fact that they had been Christians, that these people had been Christians from the earliest days, meant nothing to these people. As far as the KKK was concerned, they were the wrong kind of Christians. They looked different. They acted different. So they were different. And because they were different, they were hated. The event was devastating. The family hardly knew what to do, and yet there was one thing they all knew would never change. Let me explain, Alexander said. The thing is, in our family, there was one rule that was absolute. We all called it Ceto's rule. And as far as I knew, there was Ceto's rule, and a little bit below that, maybe the 10 Commandments. But Ceto's rule came first. It was number one. Ceto's rule was this: every Sunday, the entire family was to come to her no matter what. That was it. She'd say, as long as I'm healthy, everyone has to come to dinner. No exceptions, no breaks. And if I'm not healthy, everyone has to come and see me in the hospital. And if I'm dead, everyone has to come to my grave. Come every Sunday, all of you, no exceptions. So the Sunday after the fire, they all gathered as they always had, but for the first time in young Alexander's memory, they did not gather at Ceto's house. That house was gone. Instead, they went to the only other place large enough, the house of Ceto's youngest daughter. And even then, with so many in the family, the only place they could all fit was in the basement. It was unfinished, but had a cement floor. They carried down the dining room table and then set up card tables all around it. Then, when that was not enough, they took sawhorses and laid boards across them to make places for the rest. Ceto was at the head of the main table with her adult children around her. The rest of the family were at the surrounding tables. The children are all crammed along the edges, with the older ones watching the younger. As they waited for the food to come, everyone talked among themselves. There was so much talk and so much turmoil about the fact that Ceto's house had been destroyed, so much rage at the fact that the family had been attacked. It was agitated, angry, frustrated talk. The question that everyone was asking was this: what are we going to do about it? Suddenly, in the midst of it all, Ceto pushed back her chair and stood. Immediately, the room grew quieter. A few people who had turned away continued to talk, but others tapped them on the shoulders, and immediately they turned and, seeing Ceto standing, at once stopped talking too. Within seconds, the whole room was totally silent. Ceto looked around and said, "I have just one thing I want to say, just one." She paused, then circled slowly around, taking in each person in turn. "Just one thing to say," she repeated. "It's this: no hate." Then she waited. Getting no response, she shifted to face her oldest son, who was sitting beside her. Locking her eyes onto him, she said, "No hate." She then stared at him in silence. Her gaze never wavered. At last, he looked away. Slowly, he nodded. With that, Ceto turned to her oldest daughter and, holding her gaze, said again, "No hate." She then stood unmoving until her daughter nodded too. Ceto went one by one to each and every person in the room. Staring hard into their eyes, she repeated again and again, "No hate, no hate," and didn't take her eyes away until one by one they each nodded. From the oldest to the youngest, no one was left out. She even included the infants. She would look at the mother first and say, "No hate." Wait until the woman would nod, then glance at the child that she was holding and say, "Tell him too, no hate," and wait until the mother nodded again. "As long as I live," Alexander said, "I will never forget that moment. That moment when Ceto looked at me and said, 'No hate.' It changed my life." That was the moment when I realized that all those beautiful stories that Grandma Ceto had chanted to me weren't just stories. They were a way of life, a way to live my life. It was also the moment that I knew that with God's help, I would follow those stories. I would do what they taught. I would follow them from then on, for as long as I lived. That moment made all the difference. So, what is hope? Emily Dickinson says that hope is a bird that sings at night. What I take that to mean is that hope is not necessarily expecting a quick fix. Hope is the ability, the grace, to know that there is a deeper truth and be willing not only to proclaim that truth, but to sing it even in the darkness, even in hard times, so that others feel it too. The truth that that hope knows is this, that in the end, love will win. It will win even when hate seems to prevail, which means that we ourselves need never, must never give in to hate. Love wins because God wins, and God is love. This is the hope we celebrate today, the third Sunday of Advent. Let us each resolve to be that hope. Let us sing in the darkness, giving voice both for ourselves and for all those around us. Amen.